Most people think of 18th century France as a time when royalty lived lavish, extravagant lifestyles, while commoners lived in grotesque squalor. Those people are half right. The truth is, everyone lived in grotesque squalor. Prior to many of the modern conveniences most of us take for granted, maintaining one's personal hygiene could be difficult and expensive. When the French Revolution took shape, it was meant to transform the country's political landscape and secure more rights for all of its citizens, including the right to personal hygiene. Today, we're going to take a look at just how poor hygiene was during the French Revolution. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other cultures' hygiene you would like to hear about. I hope you like a classic washed French cheese, because we're about to stink up the room. The flushing toilet was invented way back in 1596, but it wasn't commonplace until 1851. The alternatives for waste disposal during the Revolutionary era were still relatively primitive, as most people used chamber pots, outhouses, or a simple hole in the ground. Emptying a chamber pot usually entailed just dumping it out the window, which could be an impromptu dung dosing to any passerbys below. While walking through a courtyard, Marie Antoinette and her sister-in-law, the Comtesse de Provence, were drenched by the contents of a chamber pot. Sacre bleu! Well, that does sound pretty horrible. It was not the worst thing to happen to Marie Antoinette. A popular misconception about King Louis XIV holds that he hated bathing and only took 3 baths in his whole life. However, in reality, Louis regularly kept clean by using the Turkish bath located at the Palace of Versailles. However, the common people of 18th century France didn't bathe often. In fact, for most of the century, the vast majority of people had no access to clean water. Even if they did, it might not have mattered because it was widely believed that bathing was unhealthy. Most believed that opening the pores of the skin with hot water invited all manners of disease into the body. Bodily filth was even believed to serve as a protective outer layer that insulated one from illness, like a smelly suit of armor. When they cleaned at all, most people would usually just take sponge baths or dry baths that used as little water as possible to rinse the face, hands, and private parts. Most people didn't care about bathing, and of the few who did, almost none had access to clean water. So as you might imagine, everybody smelled like shit. For many, the only thing that could really be done was to try and mask their body odor with perfumes. In the early part of the 18th century, perfumes were considered at least partly medicinal and were made from a wide variety of ingredients, including bear fat, viper flesh, salamander ashes, fox lungs, wolf liver, and something called oil of worm. Don't even want to know what that is. Some recipes called for precious metals like gold and silver, and others called for, bodily fluids. A person would rub the perfume all over themselves and even comb it into their hair. Man, you know you stink when dousing yourself in your own bodily fluids makes you smell better. By the end of the 18th century, perfumes were being used solely for olfactory purposes. Perfume would be dispersed into the air with burners, and some wealthy citizens even had perfume fountains in their homes. The French aristocracy spent lavishly on fragrances. Marie Antoinette's favorite contained ingredients like orange blossom, bergamot, lavender, sandalwood, and vanilla. The smell was bad, but the infrequent bathing had other side effects that could even be worse. Namely, lice. Today, lice can be easily treated with a special medicated shampoo. But historically, lice have been responsible for helping to spread epidemics like typhus. To combat lice, French nobles began shaving their heads and wearing the elaborate powdered wigs they're typically pictured in. It didn't work. The lice simply migrated their lice party to the wigs. These expensive wigs weren't an option for most people, and when the revolution came, they were viewed as a status symbol of the bourgeois. Instead of wigs, the new regime would opt for simple haircuts. The word bidet means pony or small horse and refers to the way a person must straddle the bowl to use one. No one knows exactly when or where the first bidet was invented, but it is known that one Christophe de Rosier installed one in the royal family's home in the year 1710. Since there was no indoor plumbing at the time, the earliest bidets were simple basins. Since there was no toilet paper yet, people had to use whatever was on hand, including leaves, corn cobs, grass, seashells, newspapers, or even their own hands. Nonetheless, bidets were favored by the French aristocracy, and they eventually became a status symbol. Napoleon even had a bidet made of silver, which he included in his will after his death. A silver bidet? Wow. Thanks, Uncle Napoleon. In 1769, Scottish doctor William Buchan published Domestic Medicine, an instructional book that extolled the benefits of cleanliness and urged people to bathe regularly. Despite this, the idea that bathing was good for you was slow to catch on, especially in France. By the 1780s, the French were still relatively new to the notion of bathing positivity. Even those that did accept the benefits of bathing would have had limited options, unless they were rich. There was no running water, so getting water required traveling to the closest source, which usually was polluted or tainted in some way. The limited access to water for bathing eventually grew so controversial that it became one of the motivators for the French Revolution. In 1793, the National Convention's Committee on Salubrity even declared that good hygiene was a fundamental right. Hospitals in 18th century France were more like what modern folk might think of as homeless shelters. Disadvantaged people, like orphans or the elderly poor, would go there for meals, shelter, and free medical attention. Conditions in the hospitals were typically wretched. Healthy people who merely needed a place to sleep would be placed right beside sick people with contagious diseases. One French surgeon of the era named Jacques-René Tennant described the conditions of France's healthcare system as overcrowded, unsanitary, and highly susceptible to fires. Tennant wrote a book that drew awareness to the issue, and the modernization of the hospitals became a priority of the revolution. In the 1700s, Paris was the second largest city in all of Europe, home to 600,000 baguette-eating Parisians. However, without modern sanitation, it was basically just a giant cesspool with human beings living in it. Simply walking through the streets of the city would mean going ankle-deep in mud, animal entrails, industrial runoff blood, and chamber pot slush. It was only after Napoleon III was crowned emperor in 1852 that the city finally decided to build a modern sewer and clean things up. To some people, Versailles is one of the grandest palaces ever constructed. But to the people who live there, the prestige was just a thin veneer. Built on a swamp, the palace was under near constant construction from 1682 through 1789. Dust and dirt were constantly everywhere. The real problem, though, was that Versailles didn't have much in the way of facilities. In fact, of the roughly 700 rooms contained in the palace, only 9 had anything resembling a bathroom. Well, you're probably wondering where they did all their business. Well, the 4,000 or so people who lived there would typically just relieve themselves wherever the hell they wanted to. In hallways, under staircases, kind of like your drunk college roommate. Basically, wherever. In 1764, a visitor to the palace described it as a delightful blend of dead cats, urine, excrement, slaughtered pigs, standing water, and mosquitoes. Ah, France, c'est exquisite. In Revolutionary-era France, the topic of menstruation was strictly taboo, unless you happened to be the queen. Marie Antoinette's menstrual cycle was a hot topic of conversation among ambassadors and courtiers. Producing a royal heir was the queen's primary duty, so basically everyone monitored her fertility. Much less is known about menstrual hygiene for non-royalty. The anonymously published Dictionnaire portatif des arts et métiers from the 1700s contains a description of a menstrual hygiene product called chauffoir. Consisting of several layers of linen that hung from a ribbon of cloth tied around the waist, chauffoirs were used to control both menstrual and postpartum bleeding. First appearing in 1495 during the French siege of Naples, syphilis became known as the French disease. I thought it was rudeness. Medical science being what it was, the disease wasn't well understood at the time, and in fact, it would remain enigmatic for another 300 years. During the Revolutionary era, the most common treatment for syphilis was mercury, which could be administered by several methods, including contact with the skin, oral ingestion, or, oh boy, insertion into the urethra. Oh, hello there! It was the kind of cure that was often worse than the disease. But they had to try something. The first drug effective against syphilis would be penicillin, which wouldn't be discovered until 1928. As if direct shots of mercury into the urethra wasn't unhealthy enough, the people of the 18th century, of both genders, had a habit of wearing heavy makeup made from lead. Yep, both women and men would slab a thick white foundation to their French faces and then use bright pink rouge to color their cheeks with round or triangular shapes. Lead is, toxic, which was actually known at the time. Nonetheless, the French turned their powdered cheek to that information and would cake it on. The makeup had the effect of irritating the eyes, wearing down tooth enamel, and causing baldness. In some cases, it could even be fatal. Given the general state of hygiene during the Revolution, you probably already guessed that their dental care was très mal. In fact, dentists of the era were basically just tooth pullers, and most people's teeth were simply allowed to rot. Even the king didn't have much of a dental plan. Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, had all of his upper teeth pulled by what was referred to at the time as an overzealous dentiste. It was said that the surgery damaged his palate so badly that whenever he ate soup, it would run out of his nose. Since most people's teeth were rotten, smiling was widely discouraged. It's difficult for many modern people to imagine a world where no one is telling them that they look more attractive when they smile. But in the 1780s, French artist Madame Vigée-Lebrun actually caused a scandal by painting herself with a big, rot-a-toothy grin. It wouldn't actually be until the end of the century that smiling started to become acceptable. The first washing machine was invented in England in the 1780s. However, their price meant that they were typically only available to private institutions or the very wealthiest of homes. Most people continued to do their laundry by hand, which usually entailed washing their clothes in a river and scrubbing them with rocks or a washboard. Soap at the time was still mostly homemade. A person would have to boil animal fat, collect the ash from the hearth, reduce it to lye, and then combine the lye with the fat. The soap would have been too abrasive for human skin and was mostly used on laundry. Finally, in 1790, French chemist Nicolas Leblanc discovered a process that made soap easier to manufacture and more widely available to the masses. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Leblanc. So what do you think? How would you fare en Paris during this smelly time? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.